The committee will come to order. Before we begin, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that Congressman Sablon be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's proceedings. Here, no objections, so ordered. Welcome and thank you all for joining us today for the joint hearing of the House and Senate Committees on Veterans Affairs. This afternoon, we will discuss the implementation of the John S. McCain, Daniel K. Akaka, and the Samuel R. Johnson Department of Veterans Affairs Maintaining Internal Systems and Strengthening Integrated Outside Networks Act of 2018, better known as the VA Mission Act. The Mission Act is a truly transformative piece of legislation that will impact virtually every aspect of care that VA provides. Developing it took many months of intense negotiation and close collaboration between our committees, the Trump administration, the Department, and numerous veteran service organizations, stakeholders, and advocates. We should all be proud of our work on the VA Mission Act and of the benefits our nation's veterans will derive from it in the years ahead. However, in many ways, the real work has just begun. Almost 6 months ago, the Mission Act was signed into law. Almost 6 months from now, one of the Act's most noteworthy requirements, the creation of a consolidated community care program, will go into effect. Today, at the midpoint between enactment and execution, we are here on a bicameral and bipartisan basis to evaluate both the progress the VA has made thus far with regard to the implementation of the Mission Act and the barriers that may exist to full, on-time, and on-budget implementation in the coming months. Seeing the Mission Act signed into law took the collective effort of all of us working closely together with one another and with VA senior leaders, with the White House, and with our Veteran Service Organization partners. Seeing the Mission Act implemented appropriately will require no less than the same amount of teamwork. In 2014, we passed the Choice Act in response to what can rightfully be categorized as a crisis in access. A recent news article has criticized the execution of that program, namely the high cost of administrative fees. While I do not dispute that the cost of this community care expansion were higher than typical government insurance coverage, the Choice program represented a transformational first step in how VA provides care where and when it is needed. These contracts were stood up in record time, and changes that were made both legislatively and contractually over the past 3 years as the program matured. And I will say this, as a physician, we asked the VA at that point in time to do something no one could do, which was to stand up a nationwide network in 90 days. No one could have accomplished that on time. The Choice program is not perfect, but it did allow for an undeniable expansion of access and care both internal to VA and in the community for veterans. This is why it's so vitally important that the Mission Act, which will guide VA's future coordination of care, be executed efficiently and thoughtfully. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today to provide concrete answers to our many questions about the work that the agency has been doing these last 6 months and the work that lies before you in the next 6 months and beyond. The importance and the enormity of the task ahead cannot be overstated. But I have faith in you and your team, and I know that considerable support from this administration and this Congress is behind you. We want you to succeed. I implore you to be as upfront as possible today and every day about the challenges you're facing and the help that you need from us to ensure success for our veterans. I look forward to working together to overcome any barrier that may be in your way. I will now yield to Chairman Isakson for any opening statement that he may have.
Well, Chairman Rowe, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for spearheading the calling of this meeting today to look at the first 6 months under the Mission Act. I'm glad we're doing it. And before I make my comments on the Mission Act, I want to say this. Your service when working with you has been a privilege. You have done a phenomenal job as chairman in the House, have helped us in the Senate immensely. Your goal setting and what you focused on has been unbelievable, and with the exception of a few minor things, mainly where we might have dropped the ball, we've carried the ball and made significant changes in the Veterans Administration that are going to serve us well for a lasting and a long time period of time. So I just wanted to publicly thank you for your cooperativeness spirit, your desire to work. And it's so great to have a physician at the top of the leadership in the House or the Senate, for that matter, because we make better decisions and we have people who actually have done it talking about it. It's easy for somebody like me I'm a professional patient. We need a professional doctor, and you've done a great job. And I appreciate your friendship, what you've done, and the leadership you've provided the committee. And John Tower, deserves a lot of credit too. He does a great job. Let me say this: we are prepared in the next 2 years to do everything we can do to continue the cooperative spirit between Republicans and Democrats that we've had on the Senate side, and to work on fine-tuning the acts that we've passed and implementing things that need to be done to help you and the VA, those that are here from the VA, get your jobs done. We understand that what's ahead of us is tough, but we have no choice but to see to it the VA is functioning at the highest possible level, so those who have risked their life for our nation and pledged their service to us as soldiers have the same treatment back to them when we're ensuring their health care and those benefits they're promised under the laws of the United States of America. So I look forward to serving with you and working with you, and I want to tell you how much I appreciate the great job that you've done. I want to tell my Senate membership and our committee members that are here, Democrat and Republican, we've had the greatest cooperative spirit we could have. We had the Mission Act passed in committee with only one negative vote, sailed through the floor. Y'all did a great job on your end. We realized that we dropped the ball with you on one thing. Y'all got the Blue Water Navy through on a voice vote on the floor, or a suspension vote, I think, on the floor. We failed in the Senate on 2 UCs, one today and one last week, and we're going to try one time or another, but I've still got a difficulty with 1 or 2 objections. But we're going to come right back and hit the ground running. Secretary Wilkie's done a great job of indicating he wants to work with us and help us where he can, and I'm not going to let that take that bone out of my mouth. This is one bulldog from Georgia that's going to keep that bone in my mouth until we get it done, because a lot of people in the House committee have worked on the Blue Water Navy issue, and we have in the Senate as well, and we want to do the same teamwork possible. But I primarily want to just thank you and thank Secretary Wilkie for bringing a breath of fresh air to the leadership of the VA. He's done a great job. He took over after a problematic and a tumultuous time, but he's got a good bedside manner, which most physicians have, good physicians have. He's got as a good leader for the agency. He's doing a great job. We welcome you and all your VA membership here today. So thank you very much, Chairman Rote, and Merry Christmas to everyone in the audience today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I wish that bulldog for Georgia could have done something to those folks in Alabama. I really wish that could have happened, but
I can't talk about what we want to do to the Alabama people in public, but I'll do it. I will do one other thing. I have to slip out in a minute, and I apologize when you see me slip out. It's not that I'm walking out on you, but I've got one more thing to do on our side. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been a privilege to work with the Senate this year, too, this term, I should say, the last 2 years, and I was going to reserve my remarks till the end for you, and I realize you had to leave, but what an incredible you and Senator Tester have been to work with this year. My goodness, we could have never passed 80 bills in the House and had so many heard in the Senate, and our staffs, as you pointed out, worked hand in hand behind us to make this possible. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. And I think either 29 or 30 pieces of legislation. And just very briefly, a small thing like a contract, a cable contract you might have signed, or a contract on an apartment, and then your spouse loses their life in service to the country, and you not be able to get out of that contract for a year. Now you're going to be able to hopefully be able to do that. Little things like that that don't seem like big things, but if you're the person on the end of that, they are big things. And I personally have seen it and witnessed it with my friends that have had to deal with this. So these are ideas that came from both sides of the aisle, and I want to thank all of my colleagues, both in the Senate and the House, for those ideas. I'll now yield to Mr. Takano for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Chairman Rowe and Chairman Isaacson. I look forward to working with you in the next Congress to serve our nation's veterans. I thank you, Ranking Member Tester, for also being here. Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for taking the time to testify before us today. We will always welcome the opportunity to speak with you about the progress you have made regarding the implementation of the Mission Act. It has been a little over 6 months since the Mission Act was passed, and 7 months since you were confirmed as Secretary of Veterans Affairs. I commend you on your hard work so far and assure you that as we move into the next Congress, you will continue to find a willing partner on this committee, meaning me, as the most bipartisan committee in this Congress, I intend to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, with you, Mr. Secretary, and with our VSO partners to ensure veterans get the benefits that they've earned. Transparency and open communication between the Department and Congress is key to our oversight efforts and to ensure that our work here is effective. Now, we've asked for and need information from the department so that we have an understanding of the steps VA must take to achieve the objectives mandated under the Mission Act over the next 6 months. We also need to know more about the reported outsized influence a group of advisors may have had on your decisions, as VA should not be subject to outside influence or the whims of individuals or interests who cannot be held accountable and who do not have veterans' best interests in mind. However, VA should ensure that the voices of veterans expressed through our veteran service organizations are adequately considered when important decisions such as the adoption of the designated access standards are made. The term designated access standard seems a bit wonky. So what I'd like to hear from you today is a simple explanation of what those different scenarios look like in practice. And I think to unpack designated access standard, I think for the public we can just simply understand them as the criteria by which the VA refers veterans out to private sector doctors, outside the VA, non-VA providers. What are those criteria? And of course, we know we began with an arbitrary criteria of 40 miles, living 40 miles outside of a VA radius, the radius of a VA health center, and somebody who has been waiting for more than 30 days. Without those arbitrary standards initially, we would have spent large sums of money, diverted large sums of money of VA healthcare dollars. So it's important that we get these standards right. The truth is, we've always at the VA has always embraced outside non-VA medical providers as part of the solution. And so this is nothing new in terms of how we take care of our veterans, but we can't do that at the expense of maintaining and adequately growing the internal capacity of the VA. So these access standards will outline when and where and how veterans will be referred to private sector providers under the Mission Act and how much of your budget will be needed to pay for this private sector care, which we know is often more expensive than VA's internal services. So, and we know, based off of multiple studies by the likes of the RAND Corporation and Dartmouth University, VHA care was frequently of higher quality than the private sector. So standards that are too liberal for access to private care could easily jeopardize that high quality VA care that our most vulnerable veterans rely on, as the dollars that support this care will be diverted into private sector care. So we need that right balance. So we need answers to these questions, and I remain concerned with the department's lack of transparency. For instance, yesterday we discovered via the media, not the VA, that yet another veteran has taken his life at the Bay Pines VA Medical Facility. This is the 5th suicide since 2013. We should not be first learning about this in the press. We should be notified immediately with facts that will help us act so that we can prevent other veterans from taking their lives. The GAO report requested by Ranking Member Walz demonstrates a lack of leadership and commitment by the department to prevent veteran suicide. This is the department's top clinical priority. When veterans between the ages of 18 and 34 are committing suicide at the highest rate, the department's failure to communicate services and attempt to reach veterans in this age group via social media is shameful. VA offers excellent mental health services, but to quote disabled American veterans, they are useless in actually preventing suicide if veterans and family members don't know they exist or are unable to access them. Now, it is simply wrong that only 50,000 $57,000 in funds Congress prioritized to address preventing veteran suicide has been spent, and $6.2 million has been left on the table. Now, I'm committed to achieving progress over the next 2 years, and I hope that you will, in fact, make suicide prevention the priority that the Department claims it to be, so that we, as Congress, can support, not criticize, your efforts. The same offer applies to the implementation of the Mission Act. Now, the implementation of the Mission Act thus far has been rocky, and all too often members, their staff, and veterans feel misled or misinformed. In the next Congress, let's work towards having a productive relationship and open dialogue so that we can work together on behalf of the veterans we serve. Now, I look forward to our discussion today and hope that it is the beginning of a strong partnership between the Department and Congress. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Now yield to Ranking Member Tester for any opening comments.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Rowe, Chairman Isaacson. If Tim Walsh was here, I'd be thanking him too. And Congressman Takano, thank you very, very much. Before I get into my written statement, I just want to say it's been a pleasure this last Congress working with all the other three corners. And I think what's made the relationship work is communication. We have tried not to surprise one another. We've tried to keep one another informed on where we want to go, and I just want to give you a prime example of it. When I was walking over here to this hearing just now, my staff member said, Dr. Rowe wants to say something about confirmations, and he's concerned it might embarrass you. That's damn nice of you. I just want to tell you that. And by the way, give them hell on the confirmations, because it's ridiculous that the folks aren't confirmed for ID in the Office of Whistleblower Protection. The last thing I just want to say before I go into my opening statement is Blue Water. We just did a live UC on the Senate. It was objected to. I know that the VSOs in this room have been providing information after information after information on this issue. I'm going to tell you, if we aren't willing to take care of our veterans, we shouldn't be making them. And the bottom line is we've got to get this done. The science is clear. And I would say that I think that maybe the folks in the legislative branch don't realize it, but we're different than the executive branch, and we need to make the call. And if they want to veto the damn bill, then let the executive branch veto it. In the meantime, we need to take care of our veterans. Secretary Wilkie, thank you for being here. Implementation of the Mission Act was going to fundamentally transform the delivery health system for our nation's veterans. For more than a year, we all worked carefully with the White House and the VA to negotiate the text of that bill. We were in regular communication with the VA on how it would interpret and implement the bill, passing it back and forth for technical assistance, ensuring that we were all on the same page. Since that time, though, I have grown increasingly concerned with the Department's planned implementation of the new Veterans Community Care Program created in the bill. Mr. Secretary, the VA is moving away from the direction it was headed just 6 months ago. Make no mistake about that. The most dramatic example has to do with the VA designating certain types of care as nearly automatic eligibility for community care. 6 months ago, we agreed that if veterans faced excessive wait times or driving times or distance to access certain services at a VA facility, they should be offered referrals to the community. Specifically, we discussed designating access standards for services like routine lab work and x-rays. But we agreed to give the VA the authority to decide exactly which services or categories of care should make veterans automatically eligible to receive care within the community. Now that we've passed the VA Mission Act, VA has decided to head in what I believe is a completely different direction. VA now indicates it plans to designate access standards that apply to each and every type of care a veteran might need. This would essentially outsource all segments of VA healthcare to the community based on arbitrary wait times or geographic standards, which we're supposed to be moving away from by ending the choice program. And that's despite the fact that several studies, one as recently as last week, have indicated the quality of care at the VA is good or better than the private sector. Let me say that one more time, because it's not said enough. As recently as last week, we received yet another study that indicated that VA care is as good or better than the private sector. To make matters worse, VA officials have offered only vague verbal descriptions of the various sets of potential access standards under consideration by you, Mr. Wilkie. It also concerns me that each time we've discussed this issue in the last 2 months, VA officials have given us wildly different estimates of budgetary resources needed to implement these sets of access standards that you're considering. For example, if the department chooses to go with the same access standard used by TRICARE Prime, we've been told it could cost anywhere from $1 billion for the first year to more than $20 billion over 5 years. Some of the VA estimates indicate that costs will be less than what we spent on choice, but would make a greater percentage of veterans eligible for community care referrals. That doesn't make sense. So we need to know what you're doing, Mr. Secretary, and how much it's going to cost. No conflicting or vague answers, no fuzzy math, no games, because the stakes are simply too high. Mr. Secretary, not even 6 months ago, you came before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and you said you would oppose attempts to privatize the VA healthcare system. I believe you. I believed you then, I believe you now. But if you move further down this path, gutting the VA healthcare system for those veterans who want and need to use it, you'll end up bringing down the whole boat. And you're going to spend a whole lot of time and money sending veterans into community for care that is less timely and not as high in quality. That's a bad deal for our taxpayers. It's a bad deal for our veterans who would ultimately bear the brunt of cuts to other services or benefits to cover the increased costs of community care. And that will lead to a bad deal for veterans, because at some point you'll burn through the funds quicker than expected and come to us because VHA is running out of money again. Veterans will be in limbo when seeking community care as Congress sorts out the VA's fiscal issues. I am frustrated because this hearing would have a great opportunity to talk about the great work being done by VA employees across this country every single day, and indeed they are, and about how their critical work will be bolstered by additional high-quality health care professionals hired under the new authorities within the Mission Act, and about how streamlining the various VA community care programs into new community care network will make care more efficient, more timely, and more seamless for veterans. Instead, we're here left trying to figure out why the VA decided to take things in a different direction in what I believe Congress has intended, and certainly what veterans have advocated for. My suspicion is that it's politics. I hope I'm wrong, because at the end of the day, I really hope that meaningful consultation will take place before final decisions are made. We've got this far by working together and by taking our cues from veterans, and it would be a shame to undermine those efforts and relationships because of a political agenda. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I have tremendous faith in you, Secretary Wilkie, to make sure that the VA is run in a way that our veterans deserve. We need to really step up and do it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. We're joined on our first and only panel today by the Honorable Robert Wilkie, Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs, and welcome. Secretary Wilkie, thank you for being here this afternoon. The Secretary is accompanied by Dr. Melissa Glenn, the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Enterprise Integration, and Dr. Stephen Lieberman, the Executive in charge of Veterans Health Administration. Thank you all for being here. Secretary Wilkie, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Isaacson, Chairman-elect Takano, and Senator Tester, and distinguished members of both committees. I want to thank you for the opportunity to address the efforts underway to implement the VA Mission Act, as well as share with you the governance and management approach instituted over the last 130 days. As you have said, we are on the cusp of the greatest transformative period in the history of VA, and your leadership led to the passage of that historic legislation. As I testified in front of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee earlier in the year, I am happy to report that the state of the Department of Veterans Affairs is better. And it is better because of the work of these committees and the attention paid to our department by the President. As Secretary, I've visited 17 states in 130 days, 23 hospitals from Anchorage to Orlando, 4 claims processing centers, and the Veterans Treatment Court in Maryland. And I, as Senator Tester said, am astounded by the commitment of the VA workforce. It is dedicated, and it is, in my opinion, the finest workforce in the federal government. Today, I'm honored to have with me 2 senior VA leaders, Dr. Stephen Lieberman, the current executive in charge of the Veterans Health Administration, and Dr. Melissa Glenn, the Assistant Secretary for Enterprise Integration. We are committed to implementing the Mission Act by June 2019 and describe how that commitment is being fulfilled. We have established a task force representing key offices across VA and guided by experienced program leaders. We now have a battle rhythm of progress reviews to align resources, identify and mitigate risks, and deliver on the promise to transform VA healthcare that puts veterans at the center of everything that we do. This effort is emblematic of a new governance and management structure we have established throughout the department. That is how we were able to identify that the technology supporting the GI Bill implementation was untenable. I made the decision to define a new approach to deliver education and housing benefits to our veterans and their family members. And I want to emphasize that we will execute the law as written, and every post-9/11 GI Bill beneficiary will be made whole for their housing benefits based on both Sections 107 and 501 of the Forever GI Bill. I made the decisions not only to stabilize the delivery of services, but to improve the current choice programs. The expansion and extension of the Tri-West contract ensures access to community care for our veterans. The decision allows for smoother transition to the community care network contracts when awarded. After multiple delays prior to my arrival at VA, the acquisition process and subsequent awards are back on track. Community care regions 1 through 3 will be awarded before the end of February 2019, and Region 4 is expected to be awarded in March. Once active, these contracts will support a key pillar of the Mission Act by giving veterans expanded choice in their health care. As part of our new community care program, we are addressing the timeliness and accuracy of payments to providers. We are moving away from paper claims and requiring providers to submit electronic claims through our new electronic claim administration and management system that will be deployed next year. Through the Mission Act, we have established a Center for Innovation for Care and Payment to develop new approaches to testing payment and service delivery methods. The center has developed a charter and is developing criteria for pilot projects to drive healthcare quality and efficiency. Another pillar of the Mission Act is groundbreaking support for caregivers. There are 5.5 million veteran caregivers across the country. I had the privilege several weeks ago to address the 3rd annual national convening of military and veteran caregivers jointly sponsored by the Elizabeth Dole Foundation and Veterans Affairs. The work of Senator Dole to invest in caregivers and their experiences will strengthen our ability to successfully execute an expanded program of comprehensive assistance for family caregivers under the Mission Act. I would be remiss if I did not thank the foundational VSOs for their efforts to making sure that this benefit was incorporated into the legislation. And I will take the opportunity also to thank in person someone who is familiar to all of you and who was instrumental not only in the development of the Mission Act and the caregiver program, but someone who has been on point for veterans for many years. He is retiring, and that's Gary Augustine of Disabled American Veterans, and I thank him for being here as well. The other most meaningful aspect of this legislation is the series of related products that ultimately support the work of the Asset Infrastructure Review Commission. These include outputs of national market assessments and our strategic plan, and a data-driven asset and infrastructure assessment and recommendations with input from our veterans, employees, VSOs, local communities, and other key stakeholders. VA is embracing the opportunity to assess our footprint and develop recommendations for modernization and realignment of facilities. Mr. Chairman, I would like to beg your indulgence for a minute, and I'm going to go off script. And it's partially in response to a series of stories that I read this morning, stories that have particular meaning to so many members of these committees, and that is on the issue of suicide prevention. When I was acting Secretary of the Department for 8 weeks, I declared that suicide prevention is the #1 clinical priority of the department. In addition to that, I named a permanent head of our Office of Suicide Prevention, Dr. Keita Franklin, who was the head of our efforts at the Department of Defense when I was the Undersecretary. In addition to that, we have developed with the Department of Defense a streamlined and comprehensive program to begin addressing the issues that impact our veterans and the issue of suicide, beginning from the time that they enlist. Our transition assistance program is done in conjunction with Secretary Mattis, and now, thanks to the work of this committee, we're including other than honorable dischargees in our education and outreach efforts when it comes to suicide. The tragic aspect of this is that for the 20 American warriors who take their lives on a daily basis, 14 of those warriors are outside of the Department of Veterans Affairs. When I have gone across the country, I have asked governors, I have asked mayors, I have asked VSOs to help us find those veterans. When I was in Alaska recently, I spoke to the Alaska Federation of Natives. 50% of the veterans in the state of Alaska are outside of the VA system. And I've asked them to help us find those who might be in danger. Suicide prevention is the #1 priority of this department when it comes to our clinical efforts to keep our veterans healthy and well. In addition to that, I do want to say that I echo what Senator Tester said. Last week, Dartmouth in the Annals of Internal Medicine indicated that the Department of Veterans Affairs health care, medical care, is as good or better as any in the private sector. That is a story I wish to tell. The other part of that story is, and it will come as a confounding statement for some in the press, that a conservative Republican is here saying this. I am incredibly proud to be part of the workforce that I consider to be the finest in the federal government. In my travels, I have seen the dedication of our men and women, 370,000 strong, and it is my pledge to tell the good news stories that they have created on the behalf of our veterans. In addition to that, another story that I am proud of is that the Partnership for Public Service, for the first time in memory, has now included the Department of Veterans Affairs in the top third of all federal departments when it comes to workplace satisfaction and the pride that our workers have in being part of the VA. That is a great step forward. Without that pride, we will not be able to deliver the kind of customer service that our veterans expect. In addition to that, I'm also happy to say that the Department of Veterans Affairs, when Time issued its list of the 50 most influential healthcare minds and providers in this country, the Department of Veterans Affairs had researchers on that list. It is a good news story to tell. It is one that I am proud to tell, and I am very happy and humbled to be part of that outstanding workforce that on a daily basis helps veterans remind all of us why we sleep soundly at night. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the indulgence and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And just very quickly, since we have a large number of people here, I will be dropping the gavel at 5 minutes, including myself. I appreciate you being here, but I'd like to focus today on this hearing on the implementation of the VA Mission Act, specifically the community care part, because that's coming up in 6 months. And really, it's literally, if we can do 3 things, I think, Mr. Secretary, and if you can lay out and give me some ease about how I feel about this. One, will we have networks in place? Number 2, can you schedule an appointment to the doctor in those networks? And number 3, will you pay the bills once the veterans have seen it so they don't get done for the bills? I think if we can do those 3 things, in my concern, we've got the 4 regions of the country. The various regions have a year, according to the law, to put these networks together. And I know you're signing the contracts for 3, you said hopefully by February, and then Region 4 by March. That's less than 90 days from the time this thing goes live, that last contract, because I remember very well in 2014, the fiasco that occurred there. So of those 3 things, when we go live, or are you going to need more time? And quite frankly, if you see it isn't happening, I'd rather keep doing exactly what we're doing and implement it a month later than I had to have this thing fall on its face and we fold up all the community care programs we have into one and it not work.
Yes, sir. Obviously the goal is to fulfill those time commitments. I'm going to take a step back and answer the third part of your question first, and that is the timely payment to our community caregivers and particularly our small town doctors across the country. Without that, the entire choice system contained in the Mission Act fails. We have learned valuable lessons from the experience of choice. I do believe that we have the beginnings of a comprehensive set of standards whereby we will take to the country to bring those community care providers into the networks. Those contracts are ready to go. We do have the lessons learned from, as I said, the problems that we had with choice right now, and I'll go ahead and address an issue that was raised in the media this morning. TriWest is the bridge to the expansion of our program through the community care networks. And I am confident that given the governance structure that we have in place, that we will be able to reach those goals. I will also say that if at any time I don't think we can, I will be up here post haste to make sure that that we inform the Congress of that contingency. And Dr. Lieberman wants to say anything about where we are in terms of the contracts.
So we're really pleased with how our contracting has been going. We've been meeting weekly on this, and as the Secretary said, we expect it to be completed on schedule, as he told you. And then we are ready to go with all the topics that you have brought up. You know, we certainly are implementing a number of things to help with timeliness, including the timeliness of the payments. We are going to be requiring, except in rare circumstances, that the payments be electronic, which speeds up the claims process. We also are going to have a off-the-shelf product that will auto-adjudicate the claims and pay them timely.
And I would note, sorry, that's key. The Department of Veterans Affairs, as these committees have noted on more than one occasion, has an IT problem. When it comes to claims processing, hands have to touch each claim. What we have done is look to the market for off-the-shelf technology that will allow us to automate the claims process so that individuals are not having to touch each claim, and this will put the Department of Veterans Affairs in line with the most modern healthcare administrations in the country.
Well, my time is about expired, but this is what I want to have happen. If I'm a patient and I come to see the doctor and I need to go see a neurologist or whomever, while I'm seeing the VA doctor that day, I walk out front. The VA doesn't have that specialist in the hospital. I get my appointment scheduled. I get it made. I go see the doctor. That information is transmitted back, and the doctor gets paid. That's how the system works. I had surgery 18 months ago. 2 weeks after surgery, the bills had been paid by the third-party administrator. And that's the kind of, I know it's not going to be that quick, but that's the kind of efficiency we want. And I hope that we have it. I'm not expecting it on June 7th, but I am expecting it sometime fairly soon. Mr. Takano, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, over the last few months, committee staff has heard from various stakeholders, including VA, conflicting information regarding VA's development and or adoption of what I talked about in my opening statement, designated access standards. We've also heard from VA staff the President is likely to announce the adoption of a designated access standard model during his State of the Union address. However, Congress has not yet been made aware of which models are being considered and the reasoning behind any imminent decisions. Would you commit to us today that you're willing to offer each of the four corners, and I would say members of the committee, but I mean it should be made available to all of us, a briefing by Milliman, who's the actuary, prior to the State of the Union, and reasonably before the State of the Union?
Well, Mr. Takano, what I will promise is that as soon as the President is briefed, I owe him that courtesy, and certainly he is responsible for the final decision. And once he makes that decision, I will be up here with our team to brief this committee, these committees, for any comments and advice you have and any corrective actions that you might have. It's absolutely vital. I think I mentioned in my confirmation hearing, I grew up in this institution. I know why Article 1 is the first article. And I will commit to coming up here when the President does make his decision. And it is still not clear if he's going to announce anything at the State of the Union, but I hope to have him briefed and have those decisions made before then.
Mr. Secretary, I'm a little concerned that this decision can be made, you know, the night before he delivers this speech and makes a grand speech about how every veteran is going to be able to see any doctor they want to see. I mean, that's one model. Veteran could see any doctor they want to see. Of course, that sounds good, but there's a lot of downsides to that kind of a model. That all the more reason why. I mean, the VSOs are many of them are complaining that there's a lack of participation, as per what we said in the Mission Act, that they should be participating in the development of these access standards, and so I'm not really satisfied with the answer. I wish we were able to get better insight as to what models you're considering, what the costs are associated with each of those models, because that has a lot to do with about how much money might be diverted from, you know, regular central VA care.
Mr. Takano, let me answer the second part of the question first. In terms of engagement with the VSOs, I can say that they are a vital part of what we do at the department. In my time as secretary, we have doubled the number of VSO engagements that the department had prior to my arrival. The majority of our VSO engagements are handled at the undersecretary level or above. Over the last 9 weeks, our VSOs have experienced briefings from senior leadership in the department that last well over 4 hours a week. I will also tell you that in my travels across the country, I have made it a point to reach out to veterans organizations in the rest of the United States. In Alaska, I spoke to the largest VFW post, I think, west of the Mississippi. I was just in your area of California, spent 2 hours with veterans leadership in Southern California, did the same thing with the Indian nations, the Native nations in Oklahoma, and also in Senator Hirono's state in Hawaii on the Big Island, and also in Oahu. So that is important to me. If the veteran is not at the center of the decisions, it won't work. But I will say, when it comes to access standards, I have in mind not only Senator Tester's state of Montana when it comes to the ability of our veterans to get to services, but also have in mind some of the most heavily congested metropolitan areas of this country. We have to make it easier for our veterans to get the care that they need. But I will also say, and I will repeat what I said when I testified in the Senate in September. My observation, my experience, and Senator Tester said it earlier today, veterans are happy with the service they get at the Department of Veterans Affairs. I have not seen any indication that the majority of our veterans are chomping at the bit to find alternative ways to take care of themselves. The most important part of this is the one that is not quantifiable, and that is the communal nature of veterans' care. Veterans want to go places where people speak the language and understand the culture. That is what I have experienced in my lifetime around the military, and that has certainly been validated in the travels that I've undertaken in the very short time that I've been the secretary. Veterans will always be at the center of any decision that I make.
Okay. Appreciate the gentleman for yielding. Senator Tester, you recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Secretary, you and Dr. Glenn and Dr. Lieberman for being here. I am sure, Mr. Secretary, you're aware of an article that was published yesterday outlining the overhead costs of the Choice Program. it was reported that 1.9 billion, nearly a quarter of the funds spent on choice, were for admin fees. I've got a huge problem with that. Do you have a problem with that?
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving forward, what are you going to do, or what are you doing when it comes to admin costs from the private providers?
Well, in order to move forward, Senator, may I please take a step back?
Quick step.
This committee addressed the problems with choice with the Mission Act. The article in question addressed the problems with the system before Mission was passed, before I became the secretary. I am cognizant of what went on with choice, and you mentioned it, hastily put together in response to a tragedy in Arizona. So it is my direction, and I believe because of the negotiations that we've been having with the potential community care providers, that those administrative costs you will not see at the level that we experienced during choice, because the department, I will admit, was taken advantage of because of the hasty nature that took
Okay.
place when the program was put together.
I will kind of accept that, but a lot of the folks who are delivering the care now under your thumb are close to 1/4 in admin costs, close to 1/4. Now, I asked my staff to find out where the VA was before choice for admin, but as I recall, it was one of, if not the cheapest delivery care system in the nation when it comes to an admin cost. So I would say that. The other thing I would say is this, and Congressman Takano talked about this. If access standard models are expanded to the point, and I don't think it was congressional intent for this, in fact, I know it wasn't, for unfettered choice, we got a big problem because it's going to cost more money. The care isn't going to be good. I talked in my opening statement about Blue Water veterans. You know why we can't get Blue Water folks covered? Money. So extrapolate this out a little bit. If it costs more to be in the private sector, if admin costs are higher, benefits are going to be cut. And so while you say it's the president's decision, and it is, he's the boss, there better be some good information coming from you and the people that know better that this access standard needs to have some controls around it. Would you agree?
I agree with you.
I just want to mention that the administrative costs are not as high as was quoted in that article. The number is less, and it's actually been over years, so it is a much lower percentage. We have learned since choice was first implemented in a hurry. What we've now moved towards is itemization of the administrative charges, so there is now a range of what the charges are, and to close to the amount that was in the article per individual. But then with the community care network,
So-
we're actually have learned more, and we're going to go to a new model which will further decrease the administrative costs.
Okay, and so are you planning on putting overhead caps in those contracts?
We're moving towards a standard that similar to what the community
So
does.
that's a no, correctly? You're not going to put caps in them?
We certainly can.
No, I'm not advocating for it, but what I'm saying is that somebody's got to have the finger on these costs, because I'll tell you, we're talking billions of dollars, and after the fact, we can't get it back. And those are dollars that should be spent taking care of veterans. So do we have a plan? Because the truth is the Mission Act, we passed it with the best of intentions, but it could be a train wreck too, and I hate to tell you this, but it's kind of in your lap. It is in your lap. And so when we're talking about too high admission costs, when we're talking access standard models that were basically unfettered choice, we could end up with a problem where we're actually cutting benefits for our veterans moving forward. And my guess is if you asked any of the VSOs that would not be a good thing. So I just want to make sure that's on your radar screen. I got to have one more because I got to get in. I only got 25 seconds left. You talked about giving information to the VSOs. You talked about briefings. Are you gathering information back from them? That this just isn't an information dump on the VSOs, that you're actually listening to them and finding out what their concerns are, because I'm telling you, it's critical. It's critical for us. It's critical for you. Did you want to answer that, Dr. Glenn?
No, I can do it. Yes,
Go ahead.
absolutely. In fact, many of the people in the audience will be with me tomorrow morning in my office discussing what was discussed here, and they will be telling me their input after.
So I'm not throwing anybody under the bus here, but I'm going to tell you that a lot of VSOs have talked to me about the communication within the VA. It's not where it needs to be.
Senator, let me add one thing to that.
Okay?
If you could add
I
that pretty
apologize.
quickly.
I'll do it real fast. Something has happened in the makeup of our veterans population. For the first time since the fall of Saigon, half of our veterans are now under the age of 65, which means they have different cares, they have different interests. What I have done in my short time is actually open the aperture to the table at the Department of Veterans Affairs to bring in veterans who are not traditionally part of the system, Purple Heart, blinded veterans, student veterans. In fact, we have more veterans at the table discussing their issues with us than we have ever had, and that mirrors the change in the active duty, reserve, and retiree population that we've seen. So you have my commitment that every veteran who wants to talk will be heard and input be given.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Senator Moran, you recognize.
Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, thank you for you and your team's presence today. I asked my staff to give me the statutory requirements of your consultation with Congress, and it turned out to be pages. In the Mission Act, you are directed to consult with us as you develop regulations. And the goal of that language was to make certain that Congress was informed before the regulations were determined, not a consultation that says this is what the regulations will be. My understanding is that those consultations that have occurred have progressively gotten better. We still want more specificity, and you seem to be headed in that direction, but I would encourage you and your team, as we get those briefings, to give us the details so that we can encourage, comment, suggest in advance of decisions made at the Department of Veterans Affairs. That was a very intentional aspect of the language included in the bill. Let me see if I can get a couple of things in the 4 minutes I now have left that are specific. First of all, how you define, how the Department of Veteran Affairs defines episodic care is a hugely important issue in regard to how the Mission Act will be implemented and what kind of care our veterans will receive. Can you, Mr. Secretary, in a specific way, tell me how you will define episodic care?
Well, I will let the doctor describe that.
Doctor, thank you.
So it will depend on what the issue. Thank you. So it will depend on what the issue is. Certainly, we have the 6 different criteria that go into it. If it is something where you require orthopedic surgery, require physical therapy, we will bundle the care for that. Whereas if we can't provide it, we would provide it outside.
Obviously, in 4 minutes, there's not a way to be terribly specific, but it will be something we will continue to ask you. I would tell you that my interest in these topics is generated by our casework, what veterans bring to our office and what problems they've had under choice. The idea that you have to go back to the VA every time to get the laboratory work, the x-ray, that is not an efficient system and one that's designed to fail and not be beneficial to the veteran. Would you commit that we'll be able to review your definition, Mr. Secretary, of episodic care before the regulatory process?
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Let me then turn to access standards, which has been a topic of conversation by most of my colleagues who have spoken already this morning. Here is what I would look for in today's setting. I'd like to have assurance that access standards will be applied to where a veteran actually lives, not his post office, his or her post office box, as has been the case in the past.
Absolutely. And I've said on many occasions, and most of my focus has been on the Western United States. That is absolutely necessary if we're going to make choice work. It's striking to me that still in 2018 we don't understand the scale of the American West. And what you've said is absolutely essential if we're going to make access standards work.
Another piece of casework that has become a challenge for us is the definition of in the VA. And that is the that in circumstances in which our veterans are trying to access care, the VA's response is the care is available within the VA broadly. In my view, the question is the care in the VA available at the facility, the hospital, where the veteran lives? And our veterans are being asked to travel long distances because the care is available in the VA, but not geographically available.
And that is one of the things that we will fix as a result of the Mission Act. And we will get a system in place that allows the veteran the opportunity to get that care that is most convenient to him and to his family. Senator Tester's gone. The example I use is a 700-mile round trip in Montana. Kansas, the distances are almost as great. So absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Let's see, Senator Murray, you're recognized.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, before I get into the main focus of this hearing and my concerns about the caregiver bill, I do want to mention the current chaos with the GI Bill.
Yes.
It is unacceptable to leave veterans without a stipend or an incorrect stipend or a delayed stipend, especially when they rely on that to pay for rent or food. And it is unacceptable to put veterans' enrollment at risk by failing to get tuition payments to the universities as well on time. These are basic tasks that the VA cannot get wrong. You've had more than a year now to implement the changes in the Forever GI Bill. I've written you 2 letters, one more than a month ago, one 3 weeks ago, looking for answers on how the VA is going to fix these payment problems, how they're going to address the shortcomings with the GI bill comparison tool, and especially in light of the recent collapse of ECA, to explain why the Department of Education has stopped sharing accreditation information with the VA. I don't want you to take the time to answer right now. I would like a written response back to those, and I want you to know we're all very concerned about it. But I do want to ask about the caregivers program, because according to briefings from the VA, the department has ruled out trying to narrow the eligibility criteria for the caregiver program, but I am still very concerned that there's a number of issues the VA is looking at that I'm concerned about, including changes to the stipend, restricting veterans based on their type of injury, or requiring a minimum disability rating. This seems to be VA still focused on keeping people out of the program instead of making it work better for our veterans. And yesterday, NPR reported on several cases where veterans, including a double and a triple amputee, were downgraded or kicked out of the program completely inappropriately. And these are, by the way, not one-off VA cases. We're hearing that this is a continuing problem in the VA's management of this program. When the VA previously downgraded and terminated caregivers, the VA assured me that it had resolved the problems that led to these type of actions, but it's very clear that's not true. And I would like you to immediately reinstate a ban on downgrades and terminations until VA can demonstrate to us that the serious management problems have been corrected and these types of outrageous errors will not occur again.
Senator, I will say that caregivers is especially important to me. I'm the son of a gravely wounded Vietnam
I appreciate
warrior.
that.
And I've seen my mother and family take care of my father prior to his passing last week.
I appreciate that.
The
Will you
stories,
reinstate the ban?
yes.
Will you reinstate the ban?
I will. I'm not familiar with all the rules, but I will tell you that the National Public Radio story, that problem was corrected within 24 to 48 hours.
Well, those are not isolated cases. We're hearing many of them.
And those cases, as my understanding, have been corrected because of directives from this department that people were not reading the regulations properly. So my promise to you is that I am going to do everything I can to make sure everybody stays in the program. It's that important to me personally.
Can I have your assurance that no one else will be downgraded or kicked out of the program until you look and make sure that the regulations are being implemented at every level correctly?
Absolutely. I will make that commitment and will brief these committees.
Okay. And also, and I won't have enough time, but I'd like you to get me what your guidance to the program office is and your guidance to the field on how this is being implemented so that we can see what you're telling your staff.
Yep. Yes.
Okay, and I'm also very concerned about the implementation of the changes to the caregiver program that were passed as part of the Mission Act. Before the expansion can begin, you have to certify that a new IT system is in place. And the law required you to have that system in place by October 1st. That was a month and a half ago. This was not a new requirement. GAO's initial recommendation to fix the IT system was made in September of 2014, and the VA has repeatedly assured us that it is working on that issue. I want to know when you will have that IT system in place and make the certification as the law requires.
The goal is October 1st.
That was a month and a half ago.
I would not be telling you the truth if I told you that I was absolutely certain that given the state of VA's IT system that date will be met.
That was a month and a half ago.
Yeah.
The date's passed.
No, I'm talking about no, it's October of 2019
No.
to certify that the IT works. Are we confusing two dates?
That's your new goal. That's
Yeah.
not the goal you were given by Congress.
Go ahead.
Yep.
The timeline to certify the new system is ready is October 19.
Okay.
We did miss the October 18 date to put forth a new system.
You gave yourselves another year.
Well, there are two dates, Senator, associated with the requirement. The first date, which was October of this year, was for validating and deploying a new system. We have not deployed the new system, but the certification of that system, which is required prior to expansion.
Okay. Have you fully defined all of the requirements for that system?
We have fully defined requirements. We are working, as the Secretary mentioned, on user acceptance testing of the system, and we are working through that. We do not want to deploy a system until it has been thoroughly tested and we feel is capable of serving caregivers and veterans' needs.
And I would say that has been the problem that I identified and discussed with the members of this committee. GI Bill was a classic case, Senator, of a program being imposed on a system that was incapable of handling it. That's why I had to make the decision to go back to the old system on the GI Bill. The same applies here. The system was not capable of addressing it. I give you my commitment. I'm doing everything that I can, and so is the department, to bring the IT system up to modern standards. The GI Bill, we were talking about a 50-year-old IT system. And it's not acceptable, but you have my commitment that we are working with the best minds we can find to make VA a modern healthcare administration and benefits.
Mr. Chairman, I know my time is out. I've been on this committee for more than 20 years, and I always hear we're not going to get an IT system because there's a problem. Every time it changes, every time there's problems, we have got to get this right. People are counting on it.
Good. I appreciate the gentlelady yielding back, and all I can say is amen to that IT. I've heard it for 10 years. Now yield, and please be respectful of everyone's time because there are a lot of people here. General Bergman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I could yield back right now, but I won't. Folks, we'll get to the heart of the matter very quickly. You're designing a system that you're going to implement for the benefit of the outcome of the veterans. In my district, 1st District of Michigan, if any system will work in that district, it'll work anywhere because you have a largely rural district with some small cities. So I am hoping, or at least optimistic, that you have factored that in, that whatever system you're designing to get the veterans, caregivers, in this case, into a functional status, that you consider the tyranny of distance, the tyranny of weather, and all of that. Now, in setting up your network, I'm guessing, although I don't see it in the slides, there are certain assumptions that you have made and certain risk assessment involved with those assumptions, and I'd like to ask you to just take this for the record. If you could, we don't need to talk about it here, but if you would give us, though, that list of assumptions and the risks that you have, put together, that would be greatly helpful. And I noticed in the slides here, great slides, I would guess at these meetings that are, whether they be weekly, daily, bi-monthly, when you find there's a course correction as a result of a meeting or an update that needs to be made, what do you do? I mean, I don't see that in the slides. Okay, we've ID'd it. You know, I'm a pilot. You see a need to change your heading? Change your heading. Don't wait.
Thank you, Congressman. Right now, our team actually is engaged in 180-day reviews back at the VA on all elements and the provisions of the Mission Act. And we are, as you say, identifying risks and identifying, as Senator Murray highlighted, concerns with things like IT. How do we take different parallel paths towards getting to that October date? So we're bringing that through our executive committee and then issuing guidance to the teams, working through resource requirements, working through changes in project plans, understanding what our needs are, and bringing forward a stakeholder engagement protocol so we can continue to uplift this program and make sure we can hit the date.
Do you feel that there is, it seems like, as chairman on the subcommittee on oversight and investigation, one of the questions was always asked in every hearing, is there a sense of urgency? You know, within your folks that are trying to implement, you got good people trying to do the right things. Is there a sense of, this may sound like an oxymoron, bureaucratic urgency?
Well, yes, sir. And that's one of the reasons why a battle rhythm was implemented. I have, as you know, a military background, not as extensive as yours. The department has never had a governance structure for anything this complex, and we do now. And we have timelines to meet just as we would on the flight line in my Air Force life. So, yes. And I'll also point back to what I said earlier about the attitude of those in the department. It's been my experience that we have incredible support from those in the career leadership, because they understand that VA can't fail on this one. And I'm very happy with that attitude.
Okay. Well, number one, thank you for your service, and all honorable service it should be respected by all. And I could just say personally, the biggest, proudest moment I've had is to lead Marines and be mentored by Lance Corporals who have a 20-year-old view of the world, and that's what drives us. But with that, in the interest of time, I'm going to yield back 50 seconds.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and one of the things our Senate colleagues could do to help the Secretary is to confirm his Assistant Secretary for IT. That would be helpful. I'll now yield to Ms. Brownlee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us today. I wanted to follow up with Senator Murray's questioning with regards to the caregiver program. And if I could, I heard you make a commitment, but I want to be abundantly clear that you are committing to us today to not modify any of the current eligibility requirements within the caregiver program as it expands.
I am committing to review every case involving a caregiver who is in distress. I am also committed to making sure that before any decision is made on the future of the program, that this committee is involved in it. And as I told Senator Murray, I will be reporting to her on the path forward. It is important to me personally because of my own experiences, and we're going to get this right for the 5.5 million family caregivers out there.
You mentioned earlier in response to some other questions with regards to the importance of the input of VSOs and veterans in general. You responded, I think, by saying you've even expanded that audience of veterans from younger veterans and trying to get a broader representation, which I think is good. On the other hand, the leadership of the VSOs really lead by consensus within their organization and representing that broad census. So, and I too have heard from many of the VSOs that they don't feel, and particularly in the caregiver expansion, that they are or have not been involved to the degree that I believe, and I think we all believe, that they should be in terms of properly making right decisions as you move through this process.
Well, you have my commitment, and so do they, that they will be involved, they are involved in making sure that we make the right decisions. But I will fall back on what I said earlier. It's important for us, as you pointed out, to make sure that we hear from the entire cross-section of the nation's veterans. I said in my statement that on the caregiver effort, that would not have been able to come to the finish line without the work of what I call the foundational VSOs. And that is my recognition that they are central to the entire issue of caregivers, because the majority of veterans who are in that category and who need that family care at home come from Vietnam, the Vietnam era, some less in the Korean era, and the foundational VSOs are the ones who represent the community most impacted by the caregiver.
And can you commit to providing our committee progress reports in terms of the IT system for the caregiver,
yes,
so that we can feel as confident as you do in terms of meeting the October 2019 deadline?
Absolutely.
That would be great. Just in terms of broadly, you know, the governance structure that you've set up for assistance in the implementation of the mission program. I think, you know, one of my frustrations on the committee, I've served on the committee now for 6 years, is that we have VA representatives come to testify. They're updating. In this case, we're going to want, obviously, frequent updates on the progress with the implementation of the mission program. But many times they come, they avoid answering the tough questions. The response is usually, we'll take it for the record, we'll get back to you. I have found that I don't get responses. If I do, it's months and months later. So I just, you know, would like, again, to get your commitment that if it's you or others representing you, that you will provide us with the best information possible to be informed and prepared for our questions. And at the end of the day, given you've set up a governance structure, that I want to hear from you that at the end of the day, the buck stops with you, and that you alone are accountable for the successful, hopefully, completion of the Mission Act.
Congressman, that is right. I mean, I'm accountable to you, I'm accountable to the VSOs, and I'm accountable to veterans. I will say, and I mentioned having grown up in this institution, that I will note that in the time that I have been the secretary and the acting secretary, we have seen a 20% increase in terms of the number of roundtable briefings that we've given to committees and the committee and staff, and we have seen a 50% increase in terms of the number of actual individual congressional engagements with offices across the Congress. That is part of the commitment I made to Senator Isaacson and Senator Tester in my confirmation hearing. I will make that better. Again, having grown up in the institution, I am aware of Article 1.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding. Mr. Banks, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in my mind, the Mission Act is about making sure that community care dollars that Congress appropriates actually makes it and reaches the veteran. Our committees have a spirited debate every year about the funding levels, but the reality is, and you can pick your analogy here, it seems like we've been pouring money into a leaky bucket or through a clogged up pipe. When authorizations get delayed or lost, the veteran does not receive the necessary care in a timely fashion. When the providers do not get paid, they eventually drop out of the network, and the veteran far too often winds up in collections. So by consolidating all of the different legal authorities and programs for community care, the Mission Act actually gives the VA the first chance in years to actually make the system work. My question to you, though, is this. Do you agree that the Mission Act merely makes it possible, and the law's implementation is only the beginning of a lot of hard work to establish better payment procedures, stronger audits, connected IT systems, improved customer service, clear communication to veterans, and in so many other areas?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is the greatest first step, but it can't stop.
I appreciate that sentiment, but I do want to explore one aspect of that hard work. Achieving interoperability with the community providers and their EHRs is one of my top priorities, and I know from speaking with you personally, it's one of your top priorities as well. The VA implementing Cerner is going to advance interoperability with community providers that already run Cerner. But what about the other medical practices that have other EHRs? What is the linkage between the Office of Community Care and the Office of Electronic Health Record Modernization to start specifically attacking that problem?
Right now, I will confess I'm not an IT expert, but right now we are testing those standards, those operations in the Pacific Northwest and in Alaska, so that these systems talk to each other. Our first goal was to make sure that DOD and VA talk to each other. I think we're pretty far along the road on that. The next is to make sure that we communicate with doctors in the private sector, community care hospitals, as well as private pharmacies, and to talk to those systems that are not part of the Cerner network. It's done in other areas of the country. I'm confident that it will be done here. I will say quickly, you're absolutely right about the interoperability. And I will also say to the issue of privatization, I have argued that the success of the electronic health record system ensures that VA will stay at the center of a veteran's health care, that VA will be the central node no matter what that veteran decides to do, and that is one of the answers when it comes to the issue of privatization. I see that as a veteran myself. I see that when I look at the experiences of people in my family as well.
Appreciate that. One of the other key areas is claims processing. We've talked about this a little bit already, but the VA is essentially asking the Consolidated Community Care Network contractors, whoever wins the contracts, to bring to the table a new and improved claims processing system. VA is still going to have to pay the companies somehow, though, but the idea here seems to be to outsource the IT system along most of the claims paying function. Can you please comment on the thinking here and how that will improve the situation?
So, thank you, Congressman. Overall, we are making, as you have mentioned specifically, there are many changes. It's not just the consolidation of the regulations that govern the Choice Program now. We are implementing an electronic claims payment system so we can auto-adjudicate claims. We also are changing the way we will pay the third-party administrators as well, so that they have the funding available to pay the providers. So all of that has to happen in tandem and as part of the implementation to get to June 6th. So as you mentioned, there are many aspects of this, and that is certainly not just a consolidation of programs and new regulations. It is building up the technical infrastructure associated with the community care program. And there will be changes in how the TPAs are paid as well. And we have committed significantly to looking at the potential for fraud, waste, and abuse in that system.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Lamb, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Are you aware the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the Mission Act would cost around $46.5 billion over the 4 years from 2019 to 2023.
Yes, sir.
That number is familiar to you?
Yes.
Now, as far as I'm aware, there's no pay for that is specifically for that $46.5 billion, right?
Correct.
Okay. And those would be discretionary funds?
Yes.
So they would count against the budget cap on VA under the current arrangement?
Probably. Yes, sir.
And if we went over that budget cap because of this $46.5 billion or any other spending, that would trigger sequestration, right?
Correct.
So in other words, for that $46.5 billion, in order to avoid the sequestration, we'll have to find the money within VA's current budget, right?
Correct.
Okay, now, are you aware that the President has asked that each of his agencies cut their total budget by 5%?
Yes, I am.
Did you receive that request yourself from the President?
I did.
Okay. Now, do you have a plan to do that?
I have discussed the plan with OMB.
What is the plan?
I've discussed the plan with OMB. The President hasn't approved it, so I will wait for his decision.
Will the money for community care be cut by 5%?
I am, well, first of all, I'll just say for the choice program, we're fully funded. We're funded into next year. I have no, and I will say that in the submission that I made, there were no cuts in community care.
There were no cuts in community care. So the 5% would come from the rest of the VA's budget that does not involve community care,
Absolutely.
correct?
And as a steward of the taxpayers' money, I'm going to do my best to make sure that we are as efficient and lean as possible.
So actually, the non-community care part of the VA's budget is going to be cut twice, right? It's going to be cut by this 5% requirement, and it's going to be cut by whatever needs to be spent on community care.
Well, we don't know where it's going to be cut. I have made proposals.
You have made a proposal.
I have made a proposal.
And you're not sharing with us any of the details of that proposal?
Because I have not had that conversation with the President.
Does it involve cuts to personnel?
It makes efficiencies in the system, I will say that.
Does it involve fewer personnel 2 or 3 years from now than there are today?
No, I don't. I can't say that. I can say that in the last fiscal year, we've hired 11,000 more employees at VA. So we have been hiring at a very steady rate.
Will you commit to providing us before the end of this year an itemization of the things that you propose to be cut with that 5% requirement?
I commit to discussing with the committee at the earliest possible date the decisions that are made by the people who are responsible for those decisions. Again, I owe the President the courtesy of having him make the decision and then come to the Congress, and you are the ultimate arbiter of what that budget will be. I can tell you from my experience what usually happens in Democrat and Republican administrations when a budget comes to Congress. I can't think of the last time one was passed as it came over from the White House. That's just the practical nature of the business.
Do you know when you'll find out from OMB or from the President?
Oh, I certainly hope in the next few weeks.
Okay, and we do have your commitment, once you receive word from them, to brief us on your proposed cuts to the VA.
Once the President has given the all clear, and you know the dance that goes on with the budget process, usually coming in to the finish line sometime in February. I will be as transparent as I can be within the strictures of the system as it has existed for all the way back to 1974.
Well, we would like to see an itemized proposal that you have given to the White House as to what should be cut, and we would like to see that at the earliest possible date.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, for yielding. Just to clarify a little of this, it does get wonky, but the fact that you would cut 5% doesn't necessarily mean it would come out of the VA's budget. And I would refer to this graph right here. You can take a look at. These are the number of employees right here, Mr. Lamb, that have been hired. And I've been here 10 years and looked at this, and the VA has had an average of employees who left from 2013 to 2017 of about 25,000 per year, and they've averaged hiring 31,000 during that time. And on the budget caps, if we go back to the sequester levels, that was way for 2 years. We've gone from 97 billion when I showed up here in 2009 to this. I think this last budget was 206 billion. So it's over doubled in the last 10 years, and we found that money elsewhere in the caps. It didn't necessarily come from the VA. The VA actually benefited under the caps.
Mr. Chairman, may I make one more comment to
Yes.
Mr. Lamb's line of questioning? And I may be out ahead of my skis. I've come from the Department of Defense. I am now at the other department in the federal government whose needs, its mission is unique. I mean, you've served in one of the two departments. As the chairman has said, our budget has been going up. It is at record levels. I do expect the president to continue his robust support for this department as he has for the Department of Defense. We are different, and as the chairman has said, that has been reflected in the increase of our budget and the priority which this administration has placed on both Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank you. Ms. Radewagen, you're recognized.
Talofa. I want to thank Chairman Isaacson, Chairman Rowe, and Ranking Members Tester and Walz, who's not here, for holding this joint hearing, and greetings, Chairman-elect Takano. I want to thank Secretary Wilkin and the panel for their testimony. I also want to thank the VA for working directly with my staff and keeping me informed on the status of the Community Care Network contracts in the U.S. territories. The Pacific territories, including my home of American Samoa, face unique challenges due to their relative isolation, both physically and economically, from the rest of the United States. So one-size-fits-all measures simply do not work for the territories, and special care must be taken to ensure that the unique health care needs of Pacific veterans are considered. To that end, I'm glad that VA is considering the uniqueness of the territories and handling their CCN contracts separately. Secretary Wilkie, VA staff briefed my office on CCN contracts just last month, and I'd like to take this opportunity to touch on the topic once again. Could you go over how the unique challenges faced by the Pacific territories will affect both the timeline for the CCN contracts and your ability to comply with Mission Act requirements? And could I also get your commitment to work with Congress so that implementation of the Mission Act, the contracts, and any future related legislation is in line with the needs of the territories? To put it another way, will you help us help you provide for our Pacific veterans? Timeliness is always a factor, but we also want to make sure we get this right.
Thank you. I just returned from Hawaii, and I made a commitment to one of your counterparts, the governor of the Northern Marianas, that I will be visiting American Samoa, Guam, and the Northern Marianas. It is important to me. I have made a commitment in the continental United States to reach out to the native peoples of this country. The same applies to the American citizens in the Pacific. No group serves in the military at a greater rate than the men and women of the Pacific Islands or the native peoples of the continental United States. The unique nature of the challenge is 4.5 million square miles that we have to take care of in the Pacific. My commitment is that that special categorization of the community care network for the islands in the Pacific will address the unique needs. We will make sure, particularly through the implementation of additional telehealth services, more robust visits from our major medical center in Hawaii to the Pacific Islands, that we always take care that the islands are recognized for the special needs that they have.
And I just wanted to add, and you probably were also briefed on this, that we want to look at how TRICARE has succeeded in these areas, lessons learned from them also. And yes, we have to get this right, and so we'll continue to work until we get this right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding. Ms. Esty, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Chairman Rowe and Chairman Isaacson and Ranking Members Tester and Waltz, in particular, for their efforts on the Blue Water Navy veterans. This is an incredibly important issue. These are folks who served decades ago, and we owe it to them, and it's relevant to today's hearing. Because if we are not managing these budgets appropriately, they will not be able to get the care they deserved. They say if you bought it, you broke it. When we break people, when we ask them to serve this country, we owe it to them to find the means, not just the will, but the means to do right by them. And I, again, thank our colleagues in the Senate for their enduring efforts to get this passed. Wanted to quickly say something on the Care for All caregivers, as Senator Murray did. Several of us have worked on these issues. And again, this is an area where we have made commitments. We know it is the preference of our veterans, and we need to find a way to honor those commitments. And that brings me to today's hearing, the utter importance of managing these budgets appropriately. We've made promises to people that we're going to get them care where they want it, how they want it. And in order to do that, we have to manage those budgets. So first, and I see I have not lost all my time here, but we will continue on. They have me at negative 12 seconds already. Will you have sufficient funds in the 802 account, given what we know right now? Do you have sufficient funds for the community care networks in the 802 accounts, given closeout costs, given authorizations and contested claims that you still need to finish? So this, wanting to make sure that we make that transition to mission, but we can't let go of what we currently have.
Yes. Let me assure you that overall we are monitoring on a very close basis the expenditures related to 802 and the current choice and PC3 programs. And we do believe and forecast that we will have funding available through the end of this fiscal year and have taken into account all closeout costs and what we believe from a claims perspective in those projections.
Thank you, Dr. Glenn. And if it turns out not to be correct, please do let us know, because obviously it is very important. We should not leave hanging in that transition.
And I would add to that, this, you are correct. This is the wave of the future for medicine, for VA care, particularly for, even though the majority are from the Vietnam era, for the new veteran. They demand service at home. They expect service at home, and the trends in medical care in this country, as you've rightly pointed to, are that people get better when they're at home. And you have my commitment to do everything I can to make sure that this is fully funded and it reaches every veteran that we can touch.
Thank you. And thank you again, Secretary, for being with us here today. I wanted to just review again from the very beginning what timeline we are to expect right now with the awarding of the contracts for Regions 1, 2, 3, and 4. Could you go over those again, because they're a little bit different than what we had in briefing, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page, please.
For 1 to 3 is by the end of February, and 4 is by the end of March.
All right, well, we will want to be, looking at that time frame again. And I'd like to return for a moment to the discussion we had on the #1 clinical priority, and that is on military suicide prevention. And it is, Secretary Wilkie, in part that connection between the handoff from DOD to the VA. That is something we need to do a much better job of. I would suggest those of us working on this on the committee really do believe a check back in 6 months after returning would be a very helpful time to make sure people are in the system, That's number one. But number two, I do have to push back, as my colleagues have. If we know for younger veterans that they are using social media and they are not already involved in the system with VA, why in the world have we barely touched the money that this Congress has allocated for you to do that outreach? It's just astounding to me, knowing that this is a group who's not in the system. They need different ways of being connected. We are baffled as to, with this epidemic of military suicide, how we have done so little to use those funds that we've allocated.
So we actually used $1.5 million of that, not as the year went on, that we used $1.5 million, but overall we actually have used $12.2 million we spent last year in outreach, and we've done a number of different efforts. We were in the Nielsen top 10 for the public service announcements. We did 22,000 outreach events last week. Last year, our suicide coordinators reached 2.2 million individuals. We also had the Be There campaign. I don't know if you saw the advertisement with Tom Hanks, and we actually set up a website with information and actually had over 100,000 hits to that site. So we've actually been very active, and this year I'm making sure that we are spending the funding 100%, and so I'm reviewing the budget monthly and making sure that this moves forward. We certainly have obligated all the dollars, and we have plans to reach out, including social media this year. We have to get it right.
And I would also say that I was responsible as the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness for instituting the training and the awareness on the part of Pentagon commands on the challenges and the threats to our servicemen and women regarding suicide. We instituted the Transition Assistance Program to include those markers indicating that there is a potential for a very tragic event. Secretary Mattis is committed to that. I am committed to being part of that. We also, thanks to these committees, are treating those who have other than honorable discharges, and making sure that they have that transition assistance and that we join with the department to try to catch this before it becomes tragic.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Senator Bozeman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Wilkie, thank you for being with us, and we really do appreciate your service very, very much. I've had the opportunity to serve on the House or Senate VA committee since I came to Congress, and over the years, I've seen the VA go repeatedly through pains of implementing many new programs. This Congress, we passed significant legislation that will bring, quote, fundamental transformation to the VA. As you know, when the VA fails to properly implement programs, these committees become the backstop to ensure resources are surged to mitigate the impact to the greatest degree possible. During a staff briefing about how the VA is going to fix its implementation of the Forever GI Bill monthly housing stipend payments, the VA was unprepared to answer basic oversight questions about how much funding had been spent on failed attempts, how much funding had been spent on efforts to react to the problem, and what lessons the VA had learned from the situation that it can take forward to other implementation efforts in the future and underway at the current time. These aren't hard-hitting questions. These are just the basics. More to the topic of this hearing, Milcon VA staff had a meeting with your staff to get an update on where the department is with determining access standards, a key factor that will have an impact on our VA funding levels. When I hear that one set of information is provided to authorizing staff, another set of information is provided to appropriating staff, and a different set of information is provided in briefing to all committee staffers, that's a problem. And I agree with you totally. The VA is filled with truly wonderful people. But when your staff comes over without their act together, with no semblance of transparency, that reflects on VA leadership, which you have direct control over. You know that it just works better when we can trust each other and work together. We simply don't have any other choice. For fiscal year 19, the Congress appropriated $5.2 billion for the Veterans Choice Fund and $9.4 billion for community care. Can you tell us what the current burn rate is of community care in the choice programs?
It's I don't remember the exact number. We can get it for you, but it's somewhere.
We've gotten two different ones, 460 or 340.
Yeah, it's my understanding is it's around 460.
Okay.
But we'll get back to you with the exact number.
And you're saying under current estimates, funding is sufficient. I guess the next question would be, if it's not, and times have come up in the past when it wasn't, how does VA intend to address any possible shortfall?
Well, I would certainly come to the Congress with that, but let me talk about the burn rate for a second. One of the things that we saw with the Choice Act is that many fewer veterans decided to take advantage of it than was originally projected after what happened in Phoenix. Of those veterans eligible for 100% care outside of the VA, less than 1% took advantage of that. That number of veterans is in the 3,000 or 4,000s. So every trend that I have seen indicates that we are well positioned to take care of choice funding for the rest of this year.
As the VA develops regulations that will govern things like rates and access standards for the Mission Act implementation, many decisions will have significant budget implications. Certainly those do. We understand VA continues to explore multiple options ranging from TRICARE standards to variations of choice and Medicare Advantage. What is the estimated budgetary impact of the range of options? When will you be prepared to let the committee know how much you expect Mission Act compliant community care to cost annually?
Well, Senator, I expect to be up here as soon as the President approves the recommendations that I give him. In terms of the access standards, I perceive them to be a hybrid of several of those programs that you just discussed, CMS, TRICARE, and that we will come to a conclusion based on the combination of those standards and what is best for veterans. But I will be up here as soon as the President approves the access standards.
Good. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for yielding back. Senator Sanders, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me get unanimous consent to place into the record a recent article that appeared in ProPublica and PolitiFact.
Without objections.
Thank you. And it talks about the fact that several private companies have been paid nearly $2 billion for overhead, including profit, to provide health care to veterans, and that's about 24% of the company's total program expenses. So we have enormous administrative costs in private care for veterans at a time when I hope we could agree that the function of the VA is to provide the highest quality care to all veterans in a cost-effective way. And Mr. Chairman, my ongoing concern, and this article kind of demonstrates that, is that we are in the process of dismembering the VA, taking resources away from the VA, putting it into the private sector, and the results will be that many of our veterans will not get the quality care that they deserve. Mr. Secretary, it is no secret, and by the way, thank you very much for being here. It is no secret that I opposed the Mission Act. There are parts of the law that I obviously support, like expanding the caregiver support program and increasing loan repayment through the Education Debt Reduction Program. However, I remain very concerned that as written and without needed funding, this law puts us into a situation where we're forcing the VA to pay for private sector care at the expense of investing in its own facility budget staff and infrastructure. And I remain very concerned about the level of understaffing at the VA that continues to exist. I fear this is nothing short of a steady march toward the privatization of the VA. And I think sometimes when people talk about the privatization of the VA, they think that one day the Secretary is going to come forward and he's going to announce the VA is now privatized. That is not the way it's going to happen. It's going to happen piece by piece by piece until over a period of time there's not much in the VA to provide the quality care that our veterans deserve. No one disagrees. We've been through this discussion a million times, that veterans should be able to seek private care in cases where the VA cannot provide the specialized care they require, or when wait times for appointments are too long, or when veterans might have to travel long distances for that care. There's no disagreement. The VA has done that for decades. But to my mind, the way to reduce wait times is not to direct resources outside the VA, as the Mission Act does, but to strengthen the VA. VA should be focused on recruiting and retaining the best healthcare professionals in our country to care for those who have put their lives on the line to defend us. VA should be focused on investing in its aging infrastructure so veterans can benefit from the best healthcare facilities, and VA should be focused on figuring out the budget it needs to provide the demands of our veterans, our veteran patients. Mr. Secretary, let me start off by asking you a simple question, and that is, the veterans organizations, to my mind, do a very good job in understanding where the veterans are at, the problems that the veterans of our country see when they interface with the VA. To my mind, what the law says is that you are to consult with the VSOs. That's what we have in law. But that does not simply mean a one-way discussion. It does not mean simply you telling them what's going on. It means you are listening to them. So let me just ask you this, Mr. Secretary. Can you tell me exactly, in as precise a way as you can, how you have solicited feedback from the VSOs and how that feedback has been incorporated into the regulations currently being written on quality and access standards? Mr. Secretary?
Well, thank you, Senator. In the little less than 4 months that I have been the Secretary, I have doubled the number of VSO engagements. I have also opened the aperture on VSO engagements by including groups that represent the new breed of veterans, even some that represent veterans going back to Vietnam that have not been included, like the blinded veterans, the Purple Heart veterans. I'm meeting tomorrow with many of the people who are in the audience today. It is absolutely essential. I have served. I have a long line of family service without talking to the veterans. And when I say talking to the veterans, when I am out in the country, in the great nations of the plains, when I was out in Oahu.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
I do meet with them. It is
right,
not a one-way discussion.
Here's the point, and I appreciate that, and I know you're trying to do that. But meeting with them and talking to them is different than listening to them. Can I have your commitment that you will incorporate their ideas and their concerns into the work that you do?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think my time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, may I answer make a comment about what Senator Sanders said? I agree with him about privatization, and I agree with him about understaffing the VA. But I do need to make it clear that we do not exist in a vacuum. The United States, as you have pointed out in many floor debates that I heard when I worked in this institution, is suffering from a shortage of mental health professionals. Yep. It is suffering from a shortage of women's health professionals. It is suffering from a shortage of primary care and internists. We are competing for those. What has happened with the Mission Act, and one of the benefits that I have now, is that I have the opportunity to offer more impressive packages to bring those healthcare providers into the VA. We're doing our level best because you are absolutely right. We are short on those. And I will also say that when it comes to privatization, you and I discussed this in your office several months ago prior to my confirmation. I believe this strongly. I've said it all across the country. I don't believe that veterans will allow VA to be privatized, and I'll tell you why. It is not anecdotal, but it is emotional. Veterans want to be where people understand their culture and speak their language.
Good.
I'm from that world. I understand it, and I agree with you that my job right now is to ensure that those veterans who need that care outside of the VA and we don't have it, get it. So
Thank you. Well, let's continue the discussion.
Yes, sir.
I think, gentlemen, I would also encourage support from the VA and from the Senate and House on a bill that I have on an immigration bill to help allow doctors who are trained here in this country to stay here. We're sending them out of the country, and it's ridiculous that we're doing that when we have such a need here. Mr. Arrington, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service. If a veteran doesn't get good care at the VHA, do the doctors still get paid over there?
Well, they get paid because they're on a federal scale. However,
so the federal government will pay them whether they serve the veterans or not. Will the administrators get a paycheck if whether or not the veterans are receiving good quality care and service?
well, I can give you an example of how I acted on that.
Just historically, is the answer that they get paid regardless of the outcome for the patient?
Historically, before the Accountability Act was passed, historically before the Mission Act was passed, the Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs was under the same strictures that every cabinet leader was under, that there was a laborious process involved in removing federal workers who did not perform. That does not exist anymore. In the 1 year that, the 1 year that I have been in and out of VA, we have removed 5,000 employees, including the director of one of our largest VA medical centers. I did that because the work was not getting done, veterans were not getting treated, and I felt that the powers that the Congress had given us needed to be exercised. And I intend to exercise those powers whenever I see a problem, because veterans are first, the institution is not first. And
I hope you continue to do that. That's the only way you're going to stay relevant. It's the only way you'll prevent the veterans from voting with their feet about where they want to go and what this all is going to look like. Let's not be so arrogant that we think we can build a mousetrap from the federal government, from Washington, that's going to satisfy the customer. Either you deliver good service and either they're satisfied or they're not. And if they aren't, they'll make the decision on whether this is privatized or not privatized or some hybrid. Good for you. I hope you continue to do it, because in the private sector, if they don't delight the customer, the private providers, they don't have a business. They can't pay the bills. They can't feed their family. That's the incentive you're competing with. And that's why I'm for choice. That's why I'm for giving the veterans freedom to choose, to opt out of a system that may not be working for them. Maybe a union-controlled, monopolistic bureaucracy isn't the best way to provide service to our heroes. I don't know. Where it's working, good, great, continue to do good. Where it's not, I get why it's not, because it's a very different animal altogether. So, okay. It was good to meet you the other night, by the way.
Good to meet you too, sir.
And your wife. I'm really not an angry guy. I'm just get fired up when I talk about this. And I know you're passionate about it too. Let me ask you this. Are people choosing to go to community care at a greater rate today than they did a year ago?
They're not choosing to go to community care at a greater rate than they did when Omar Bradley ran the VA in 1945 to 1947. It's been about the same level, which is 30 to 35% historically. I think we're even seeing, Dr. Lieberman, a slight dip in the use of community care.
So fewer veterans are choosing to go outside of the VA today than they did a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago.
a little bit, it's a small number.
Let me ask you, I'll take your word for it. Did I assume you guys measure the quality and the overall service that veterans get at the VHA? Do y'all measure the quality care and overall service at your various facilities in the VHA? Yes or no, doctor?
Within VHA?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
And do y'all compare the quality metrics and the service metrics in community care with the quality of care and service at the VHA?
Absolutely, but we also compare it to.
How do they compare, Mr. Secretary? Are they comparable? Are they better at the VA?
I will tell you, the Dartmouth released its most recent study a week or so ago in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and their conclusion was that care at the Department of Veterans Affairs is as good or better than any care in the rest of the country. That, of course, that includes community care. So we are being judged by comparison to
good. That's good.
The biggest
that's good
the
to
biggest
hear.
healthcare networks in the country.
Okay, that's good to hear. Last question. I represent a big swath of rural West Texas. How are the access standards going to affect their access to VA care?
I've talked a lot.
Now I yield back.
Congressman, about the scale of the American West. I sometimes joke that the loneliest sign in America is on Interstate 10 in Houston. It says El Paso, 910 miles. What we see access doing is offering our veterans, particularly in rural America, the opportunity to alleviate a burden on themselves and their families by giving them the option to seek care that is closer to home if they have to embark on a 300, 400, 500-mile round-trip journey to get to a VA center. As I've said many times, it is incredible that in 2018, and I saw this in Hawaii last week, we do not understand the scale of the West, and we certainly don't understand the scale of the Pacific.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Arrington, I was in Greg Walden's district in Oregon a year ago, and his congressional district has more square miles than the state of Tennessee does. So our challenge in this committee was to devise a mission act, a program that was good for rural America and for urban America. And that's hard to do when you're trying to do both. So if you're on the 405 in Los Angeles, you may be quicker to somewhere else if you're stuck on there to get an appointment if you don't live 10 miles from somewhere. So it's a real challenge to do this and to get it right where you provide the care at the point of service for those veterans. And I think the VA is moving in the right direction with their CBOC model, taking the care of the veterans. I absolutely believe that. Mr. O'Rourke, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in answer to Senator Tester's question about administrative costs totaling around 24%, and then that number was disputed, but in response you said we were taken advantage of. Could you clarify by whom the VA was taken advantage of?
I meant in a generic way that the Choice Act, and I think there is agreement from the leadership of both committees that the Choice Act was rushed, and we were given such unreal, unnatural timelines to implement a program in a 370,000
So there was no actor or third-party administrator or outside contractor who took it?
We were forced to take what we could get to implement a law based on the timeline that was created by that act, which has now been rectified by the Mission Act. So when I said taken advantage of, and I wasn't there, I was happily in the Department of Defense. What my understanding was VA had to move as rapidly as possible, and there was not that time for reflection that you would usually have in an issue like this.
The articles about the recent released GAO report about unspent suicide prevention outreach dollars 6.2 million allocated. As of September, 57,000 spent. And then, Doctor, you suggested there was perhaps another $1.5 million spent on top of that out of the 6.2. You say you will exhaust that before the end of the year. You say that you got 100,000 hits on the website. Another thing that the GAO says that is perhaps more alarming than the unspent money is that you have not established targets for the efficacy of this outreach effort. So hits to the website, don't know what it means and don't know if it matters. How do you know how you're doing on what you have established as your #1 clinical priority, suicide reduction, which I'm grateful for that that's a priority. How do you know how you're doing against that priority? What are your goals?
Well, let me talk about the national situation that we face. First of all, I was responsible for the Department of Defense end of this.
But I've got limited time, and I don't want to hear anecdote. I want to hear.
I'm not going to give you an anecdote.
Numbers.
14 of the 20 veterans who die by their own hands every day are outside of VA.
Correct. We've known that for years.
We spent $12.2 million on that outreach just in the time, I believe, that I've been in charge, which is just a few months. But I have to go beyond what that GAO report says. Talked with Governor Brown, talked with Governor Inslee, talked with Governor Ige. I am busy.
If it's your priority, what is your goal, and how are you doing against your goal? I'm not blaming you for where we are.
No.
And I don't want to know what you've done in the short period you've been here. I want to know what the goal is and how we're doing against it.
The goal is to do our best to make sure that we have done everything possible.
We'll never be able to judge you.
We will,
on that.
and that's right, we can't. So let me give you an example.
Do our best. What does that mean?
The majority of those warriors who take their own lives come from my father's warrior generation. That means these are problems that are 50 years in the making. I'm not going to tell you that I can wave a magic wand and correct problems that began when Lyndon Johnson was president. I am doing my best through the outreach that we have and the resources that start with the Department of Defense. We never had a transition program or an awareness program on suicide until the last year or so at the Department of Defense. That's where it has to start, so that we make sure that the mistakes that began back in 1968 and 69 and 1970 are not replicated now. That's not anecdote, that's just historical.
I hear you, but if you don't measure it, you'll never be able to improve it. So do you or do you not agree with the GAO's finding that you have not established targets for the majority of metrics you use to gauge the effectiveness of your suicide prevention outreach campaign? And if you agree with that, what are you doing to correct the findings?
So we concur that we did not have robust enough metrics at the time of the GAO evaluation. We are in the process, as we responded to the report, we're in the process of developing more robust ones.
When will you have them?
Later this year.
This year? This
I'm
fiscal
sorry,
year or this
2019.
Okay, thank you.
As I said, Congress, so that is, I put in place, that is the #1 clinical priority. And I can promise you that we will expend everything that we can to try to correct this and address this great national tragedy.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. I think Mr. O'Rourke's question was, if you don't know where you're going, you might end up someplace else. If you don't have your goals set, you don't meet those goals. I think that's what you were asking. Mr. Kaufman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I think the VA has always had the authority to reach out to community providers prior to the CHOICE Act, I think, in specific relationships. I'm trying to remember the name of the, is it the P3 program? P3 program. One of the complaints I've heard about that program that still exists today is that every separate agreement is negotiated independently. And what I think, and so in Colorado we've had some potential providers under the P3 program drop out because of the length of the negotiations and the complexity of the negotiations, where I think one question that they always raised to me was, why don't we simply use Medicare rates as reimbursement on the P3 program so we're not renegotiating every new agreement from scratch?
Well, we actually are moving away right now with the Tri-West, and then future with the agreements, the community care agreements with the Mission Act. And right now we have Tri-West has stood up, and actually in Colorado at Denver, and in the first week. And they are getting Medicare rates. And in the first week, they actually have entered 2,700 consults and already scheduled 500 patients. And so they have been able to create the network that the facilities have been struggling to do on their own. And so they're creating it. And that's what's going to be part of the community care networks as we roll them out.
Okay. And how are we doing in terms of efficiency on telemedicine? I think it was raised about rural America, certainly rural Colorado. It's a struggle. We've got people in Grand Junction, Colorado. There's a CBOC there, but oftentimes for care, they have to go to the VA Medical Center, Regional Medical Center, which is now in Aurora. That's a 4-hour drive. I know they're reimbursed for the mileage for that, but are we doing better in terms of telemedicine?
So we are investing through support of the Congress. We are investing in increasing bandwidth at many of our CBOC locations, which is really important. We also are doing the anywhere to anywhere, so someone has internet access in their own home, we can provide telehealth into the home. We also are entering in partnerships with different private entities they're going to give us a private room in a more rural area, and the veteran can go there and have their appointment in that location that's closer to their home. So we're really working a lot in this area.
Okay. There was legislation passed that I authored, I think was included in a larger bill, that requires an independent study as to those veterans who died, who committed suicide, who were under VA care. And I think one of the objective of it is to go to look into what prescriptions that they had at the time of their death, because I do have a concern that we are over-prescribing some of our veterans in mental health.
Yeah. Let me talk about the opioid issue, which is part of that continuum. VA and also to Congressman O'Rourke's well-founded observations about the suicide program. I do want to say that we are not divorced from national problems. We're one part of that, which is why, in the answer to your question, I will say, in this case, VA has taken the lead in creating alternative therapies, alternative prescriptions for those with great pain. The one factor about VA care that is not shared in the private sector is that we help people who come from a dangerous profession. People like my father, after 30 years of jumping out of airplanes, needed 2 new knees, 2 new hips, and had lead in his body from Vietnam. So what we have done is we've been able to reduce the amount of opioid prescriptions by 41% just in the last 2 years. In addition, we are on the cutting edge of alternative therapies, occupational therapies, Tai Chi, acupuncture, things that would have been unimaginable 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that is part of the answer to those veterans who are suffering from pain and subsequent issues like mental health.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Ms. Custer, you recognized.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And just to pick up right there, I very much appreciate the progress that is being made by the VA on the opioid epidemic, and I hope that we can spread those new alternative pain management strategies not only within the VA, but frankly within the private sector as well. I just want to revisit briefly this issue because I think certainly my constituents, but I think constituents across this country were so shocked and concerned to read today about this issue that your department had only spent 1% of the $6 million for suicide prevention. We've had a little bit more testimony on that today. you say that you're doing your best, but what I'm concerned about is that that can't be true when we have so many leadership vacancies at key posts in the VA related to these programs. What are you going to do about getting the right people in the right place? And I just want to give you one chance to revisit Mr. O'Rourke's question, because we can't really respond here in our oversight function to the concept of doing your best if we don't know what your goals are. And you talk about the majority of the suicides are committed by people outside the system. That's true. That's our frustration. How do we bring them into the system?
As Dr. Lieberman said, we began to move when I became acting. The vacancy that you talked about at the head of the Suicide Prevention Office was immediately filled by me, by making permanent the
And does
position.
that person have the staff that they need on
Yes.
board?
And also the expertise as having been the leader at the Department of Defense in the Suicide Prevention Office.
We're in the
So is
process
that
of hiring more
program
staff for
totally-
them, just for the record.
Yeah, we are in the
I'm
process.
sorry, there are other vacancies and you're in the process of hiring
We're
for
building
that
a
program?
larger office underneath this individual, so we're hiring more people to support her.
And
does that program have functional capacity at all the VISNs around the country as well?
They certainly work with all the VISNs. The VISNs have their own responsibility to roll out and work with her what ideas are coming out. I also just want to let you know that we really are focusing in a new way on the high-risk veteran populations, both within VHA and the ones outside. And so, number one, there was an executive order to work on transitioning veterans, and so we've been working with DOD on that. The other than honorable, we've been working on that since 2017, but this week, and the rest of the month, we're actually mailing out letters to the over 500,000 other than honorable, encouraging them to come to us to seek whether they're eligible for care here in mental health. And we're also looking at the reserve and the guard that have never served. They've been identified recently. As our data gets mature, we can identify more at-risk populations, and they're at risk. And so we do mobile vet center outreaches to them on the weekends when they're doing their drills, and we are reaching out to leadership in those areas. And then finally, another risk that we identified recently was that if a veteran came to the emergency room in the prior 3 months and had just a little bit of suicidal ideation, not enough to have to admit them, or that if we did research and we found that if we made a suicide safety plan with them, where if they're having suicidal thoughts, what are they going to do? Are they going to call a loved one? Are they going to call their therapist? Are they going to listen to music? What are they going to do? And it's been shown to reduce the suicide rate by 50%. And so what we've done is we've actually implemented this rapidly at all our VAs across the country. So we're really trying new novel things as they come along.
Well, and I think the research is important. My time is running short. I had another question about the whole issue under the VA Mission Act and the designated access standards, but I guess I'll just leave it at this. New Hampshire is one of the rare states without a full-service VA hospital, and I think we're all trying to find this balance of care at the VA, and if that's not possible, then care within the community. But I would just use New Hampshire as a cautionary tale and the problems that we had recently at Manchester when the level of care drops below what is necessary for a robust VA going forward. And I think that was the point that Senator Sanders was making, and I think it's instructive as we move forward. But at that, I'll yield back.
And I would just add, I agree with you completely about suicide. I mentioned that I was in and out of the VA as acting, and then had to go back to DOD and wait confirmation. In my first week, I laid down the first path on the suicide issue. I'll tell you, there's nothing more important, and there's nothing more tragic. And you have my commitment that as long as I'm privileged to be part of the VA team, that will continue to be the case.
If I could, one quick second. I've been in Congress for 6 years. You are our 5th VA secretary in those 6 years. So I appreciate your personal commitment. I have literally heard that 5 times, and veterans are dying every single day. So we will hold you to the commitment. We will want to know the metrics. I appreciate the innovative solutions, and we'll look forward to continued discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Senator Hirono, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, this one is working. Can you add to my time? Are you listening?
We froze the clock.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm glad you were in Hawaii, and obviously you spoke with Governor Ige, but did you let the congressional delegation know that you were going to be in Hawaii?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it to you the last time we spoke, that I would be in Hawaii in December.
I don't think we got the date, but not to beat you over the head with it, but I think that it would be good for you to, your team to alert the congressional delegation when you come
we
to our
did.
state, so we
We
can
did.
maximize our ability to support and work with.
We did, and I will go back on what you and I discussed last time. I made 2 commitments: one to go to Hawaii, and one to go if you're not there. I've got to go back because I'm going to go to Samoa and Guam to go with you. Go there when you were there.
Thank you very much. The VA, over the years, of course, not only have we had so many secretaries over the last 5 years, as mentioned, though, there are ongoing challenges, whether it be IT, homelessness, suicides, construction delays, of course, access to care. So you had been asked whether there is a sense of urgency at the VA, but I ask you whether you have a sense of urgency.
Absolutely.
So if you have a sense of urgency, what are your top priorities for the VA?
Well, my top priorities for the VA, and I mentioned the first clinical priority, which is suicide prevention.
Right, that's one.
My top priority is to create, with the assistance of these committees, a modern 21st century healthcare administration that keeps veterans at the center of their health care. This committee's already laid down the template for that, and it is my duty to carry that out.
So I think I'm looking for something a lot more measurable. So, for example, you were asked, how can we verify whether you're reaching your goal regarding suicide prevention? So, a former VA secretary said that his goal would be to end homelessness. So, those are the kinds of specific kinds of priorities that I am asking you to articulate.
Well,
if you have them.
I will tell you, I'm not going to come to this committee and tell you that I will end homelessness. And I'm not going to come to this committee and tell you that I can eliminate suicide amongst.
Well, that is not what I'm asking you. What I'm asking you is, what are your, out of a sense of urgency, what are your top priorities for the VA? So whether it be decreasing suicides, decreasing homelessness, so do you have those kinds of priorities?
Well, I just mentioned them. Modern 21st century healthcare administration for the VA, which means modern IT, meaning the best medical care possible.
When you say something like best medical care possible, how do you come up with a verifiable matrix?
Well, I can tell you that our health care is, and we have the standards, we have the metrics which we share with this committee. We compare what we provide with health care across the country. I've referenced the latest comparison that Dartmouth, the Ivy League, has done. That was in the Annals of Internal Medicine last week. That says
so I am running out of time.
That our care is as good or better than any in the country. I want to make sure.
If you have those priorities for you, because it would be good for us to
to hold people accountable and that there be transparency and accountability, and I would certainly want to apply that to you. So if you have those priorities and they are listed, and how you're going to, whether you have verifiable metrics to enable us to realize whether you've attained those priorities, that would be great. I have a question about the family caregiver, comprehensive assistance for family caregivers. That is a very important program for a lot of veterans, and I'm glad that we expanded it. So I have received, though, for example, a note from a caregiver in Hawaii just this week, and she wrote, quote, "I just received the devastating news that we were no longer eligible for the caregiver program. I did not even receive a phone call, follow-up from my coordinator, or even an explanation other than the fact that her husband is simply no longer eligible." So how are you communicating with the 5,500 family caregivers as to what is happening with this program, what the requirements are, et cetera?
So first of all, if your office could share with us that individual so we can follow up on.
Certainly.
So the Mission Act is giving us the tools to do this right moving forward and making sure that we have objective ways so that we make sure that we're implementing the same no matter what state you are in across the country. And part of it is what we're proposing is to move away from these reassessments and more towards wellness checks to make sure that the caregiver has what they need to succeed and the veteran is receiving the services that they need. We have regular ways that we communicate with the caregivers. We have phone calls with them around the country. We have a phone line where they can call in, and but we have not yet made our decision on how we're rolling out. We're still getting input. Right now it's in the Federal Register, some of the ideas of how to improve upon the services available in the program. So
And you're absolutely right. It's 5.5 million family caregivers.
Oh, did I say
out there that
5,500?
we have to support.
Yes. That's a lot of people to stay in touch with.
Absolutely.
But thank you, and I
But
will
it's
send
the
you the
wave of the
information
future.
regarding this particular inquiry I got. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal, you're recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. Thank you to the Secretary and your colleagues for being here today. I want to thank my House colleagues for passing the Blue Water Navy bill unanimously. I want to say how disappointed, in fact, ashamed I am that the Senate failed to do the same, even though as recently as a couple of hours ago, I was on the floor of the Senate asking for unanimous consent from my colleagues to move ahead so that that bill would become law. If the VA were doing its job and supporting this bill, it would have overcome the opposition of a small number, a handful of my colleagues, who are blocking it now. I'm going to ask you to commit, as I have before in hearings, that you will help us pass that Blue Water Navy bill.
I committed to the chairman and to Senator Tester that I would do everything I could to help your committee.
Well, you have done that before,
Yeah.
but unfortunately, that support has not been translated into active advocacy with my colleagues, and I hope you will do better during the next session. I want to follow up on a number of questions asked by Congressman O'Rourke about metrics.
Yep.
You can't do better unless you measure what you're doing. And so far as I can see, one of the chief criticisms of the GAO report has been the lack of metrics and measurement. And I would suggest to you respectfully that two good ones would be whether the rate of suicide is coming down, which it is not, and whether the GAO is using all the resources at its disposal to bring it down, which it is not. Would you agree?
Well, I agreed with the state of affairs at VA that GAO laid out.
You agree with the GAO report.
Which is why.
And so you would agree that the reason that you failed at the VA to spend more than a fraction of the money given to you by the United States Congress is, I'm quoting, the reason they did not spend the remaining funds on suicide prevention paid media in fiscal year 2018 was that the approval of this paid media plan was delayed due to changes in leadership and organizational realignment of the suicide prevention program. And they go on more specifically to say on pages 15 and 17 that it was a lack of leadership available to make decisions about the suicide prevention campaign. And then on page 17, by not assigning key leadership responsibilities and clear lines of reporting, the VHA's ability to oversee the suicide prevention media outreach activities was hindered, and these outreach activities decreased. That's a failure of leadership.
Senator, I'm going to agree with you. And you and I think, discussed in your office when I was the acting secretary that the first thing I did when I became acting, which is sort of being in limbo, but I did it anyway, was to start moving on the suicide prevention issue. I identified leadership, and I made this the #1 clinical priority. I agree that the department had not done what this Congress and what veterans demand of it, and that's
well, let me
why I
ask
moved
you,
out.
because my time is limited, I apologize for interrupting. Can you commit that the VA will spend every dime devoted by the Congress, allocated by us to suicide prevention during the coming fiscal year? Will you make that
Absolutely, and I will probably ask for more or allocate more because of this national tragedy.
How much more do you think is necessary?
I don't know. I don't know. That is why, and I mentioned, and you weren't here. In the last few weeks, I have been on the phone or in person with Jerry Brown, with Governor Ige, with Governor Inslee, discussing the way ahead. We have not had a comprehensive nationwide response to veterans' suicide. I need the cooperation of our governors, and that's why I put in train the development of the metrics that Senator Hirono talks about, that you talked about, so that we have in place a program to go and attack this problem. That's the best answer I can give you, that I moved on it as soon as I moved into VA.
Well, I know that you've moved on it, but you have to forgive me and maybe us that we've seen this movie before. As one of my colleagues remarked, we've seen a slew of secretaries who have made commitments and promises, and I think we are, at least speaking for myself, expressing the frustration and impatience that is well-founded in fact because of the turnover in leadership from the top through the middle ranks. And with all due respect, Dr. Lieberman is an example. He follows others who have been in that position for small lengths of time. We can't demand accountability if there is this constant churn and turnover in leadership, which then becomes a failure to spend the money that's allocated to suicide prevention and maybe other programs.
And I agree with your observation about suicide. The program was, at best, it was inchoate in 2017, and that is why I permanently appointed the DOD leader in suicide prevention, the person with the most expertise in this matter that available to the government, and that we are increasing the size of that operation. I agree with your criticisms.
My time has expired. I apologize, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. First of all, thank you all for being here, and I would like to yield to my colleague, Mr. Takano, next year's chairman, if he has any closing comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I do look forward to hearing as soon as possible your more about the designated access standards. I know you told me in your response to me that you still need to await the President's choices. But I hope that you will consider speaking to us before that time, because I see no reason why the VSOs and Congress cannot participate with you I think as the spirit of the Mission Act does stipulate, that these access standards were not to be developed alone between you, Mr. Secretary, and the President. And I certainly don't want to see expectations unnecessarily raised at the State of the Union speech, and Congress being in a position to have to try and pull those expectations back. So I would like to, in the time between now and the third week of January, like to see your department work more closely with the VSOs and Congress in developing these access standards, because so much is at stake. And we need to do some trust building among the stakeholders, Congress, and your department. With regard to, I want to reiterate what Senator Blumenthal has said, the frustration of Congress being able to hold the VA accountable when we've seen such changeover, or acting secretaries, and some of it is on, I hate to say, the Senate, if not confirming people in a timely manner. But nevertheless, it's been very disappointing to see in the last 2 years an administration that has not been able to put in place stable leadership at the VA. And I see the IT failure with regard to the BAH payments, the issue with the social media and adequate marketing being done to inform veterans about suicide prevention hotlines, all leading back to the same fundamental problem, which is the unstable leadership at the very top. And this has got to change. And so, Mr. Secretary, I would like nothing more than to see you succeed and for you to serve out a tenure which allows you to implement changes. And I certainly do appreciate the sentiment you expressed when you quote the Dartmouth study recently, and further back the RAND study, and that you have an understanding about how well our VA does deliver health care. And you recall that the RAND Corporation study indicated that the main problem is access. And we have still 41,000 vacancies. I want to work with you, Mr. Secretary, on not slow walking those vacancies, but doing all that we can to improve the personnel function of the VA so that applications are acknowledged, people are quickly made offers, and that we also take a look at what we need to do to develop the healthcare workforce of this country, because I think that's part of the problem. It's not just doctors, it's the technicians, it's the allied health professions that we need to pay attention to. So not everything needs to be resolved with medical degrees and four-year degrees. Some of this could actually be putting a lot of Americans to work in the service of our country. So, Mr. Secretary, in the spirit of that, I hope I intend to work with you, and I intend to that we change and turn around the situation.
I thank you, sir, and I intend to work closely with both committees. I mentioned earlier, this is where I was trained. My respect for this institution knows no bounds. And the beauty, as you said at the beginning, is that this is a bipartisan effort. I like to think of the department as being nonpartisan, like the Department of Defense. And you have my commitment to do everything that we can to make sure that the lives of our veterans are better.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. And I will, first of all, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and your team for being here today. I want to thank our staffs. We passed a major piece of legislation, the VA Mission Act, that would not have happened without the staffs. And John and Ray, thank you for your leadership. The Senate, we worked very closely with our Senate colleagues on both sides of the aisle, so thank you for the work that you all did. You were very, very helpful in this. And I personally, just as a point of personal privilege, one of the great honors of my life, served as the chairman of this committee. And I will continue to serve as ranking member just as passionately as I did before. I also want to thank, I look around this room and I see a lot of our veteran service folks out there, our veterans organizations, and they were very instrumental. I remember sitting around that table in my office for hours on end hammering out the details of this. So you had tremendous input, and it would not be the bill it is today without your input. So thank you for that. The VA Mission Act, the idea was to take a bill, a piece of legislation, and as I said before, make it applicable to rural America and make it applicable to urban America, and make sure that the number one thing that happened was that the veteran got the absolute very best care this nation has to offer, whether it was at the VA, whether it was outside the VA. I was one of those physicians who provided care outside the VA. I've also worked in a VA with some of my medical training. I've also been a doctor in the Army. So I think I understand the system fairly well. And I want to get three things out before we leave. Number one, on June the 6th, we're ready to go. And if we're not, would you be willing to come back, Mr. Secretary, let's say at the end of March, and give us one more, it could be a combined meeting or however we want to do it. It can be informal, to let the members know that we're ready to go live on the 6th of June or thereabouts. Number two, that we can make appointments at the VA for our veterans in a timely fashion. Number three, can we pay our providers so they will stay in the network? Because I have lots of friends personally who want to serve veterans right now who won't because they can't get paid. And I mean, these are good doctors that want to serve. So I'd like to see those three things happen. And certainly there'll be other hearings on the caregiver bill and on the asset review. We'll certainly do that. And I would really encourage my Senate colleagues. We have a couple of people, your IT position and the accountability and whistleblower protection. The young woman who is a staff member on our committee right now, Tammy Bonzano, an incredible young woman, an immigrant to this country, who came here without any education, served in the U.S. Navy, has gotten an RN degree, now a doctorate degree, and has done investigations of VAs all over this country. And she could be in that position right now doing her job. And I don't go to a speech that the President gives that he didn't talk about, the Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Bill. We need to get that done, and she needs to be confirmed sooner rather than later. That's a point of frustration for me to hold her up. On the mental health side, and we started with Mr. Cano's help and Mr. Rourke and others, certainly Mr. Kaufman needs to be shouted out for the work he's done. We held a hearing, and I looked at this 20 number, and that's veterans and active duty military, that number is. I said, if we're spending $8–9 billion a year and we haven't moved the needle at all, why don't we thoroughly evaluate that and change what we're doing? And there are plans out there. One in my state, Guard Your Buddy. The commander of the Guard, he took over in 2011, had 4 suicides the first 40 days he was the commander of the Tennessee State Guard. He instituted a plan called the Guard Your Buddy, and I won't go into the details of it, but he's lowered the suicide rate among our guardsmen in Tennessee by 70%. That's scalable, and it's inexpensive. We should do that across the country, evaluate what works and what absolutely we do. And Mr. O'Rourke made a great point. I was at Canandaigua. We have this great call center there. There's one in Atlanta and others standing up. But I said, are we changing anything? We're spending all this money and talking to people, but is the number still the same? We need to do something different. That's where the metrics are so important. So I think working with Mr. Takano, we'll continue to work on that. It is a tragedy beyond calculable, the suicide rates are, because I've spent it many times. I've spent hours in the operating room operating on a cancer and then treated the patient afterwards and saved one life. If, Dr. Lieberman, what you mentioned, if you've lowered the rate by as much as 55% by doing a simple thing in the emergency room, why are we doing that in every emergency room in the United States, whether you're a veteran or not? That should be done. And to Senator Hirono, your question about, it's fairly simple in medicine now. If you're looking at quality metrics, they're fairly standard, and if you just look at it, you look at what Medicare uses. Basically, the VA does the same thing, and if you come in, you're a certain age, you get screened for hemoglobin A1C if you had your mammogram if you're female, your blood pressure checked, do you exercise. It always irritates me when my doctor asks me, can I stand up? I always get a little offended by that, but they ask you those questions, and those are scalable. Vision screening, hearing screening, all of those things are measurable, and the VA, I think, does an outstanding job. And I want to finish by saying this. If what I hear about my VA at home, and this is Mountain Home VA in Johnson City, Tennessee, and I've traveled from Long Island to Los Angeles and Puerto Rico in the last 2 years, is that not 100%, but a vast majority of people like the care they get at the VA. I almost never hear anything negative. I do occasionally, as you would in a big organization like that. And it's very customer friendly. The veterans believe, and I believe, they're getting great care. I want to see every veteran get that kind of care, and I'm committed to that. I know the people, the men and women in this room, and Mr. Secretary, I absolutely know in your heart that you are committed for that. I thank you all for being here today, and I thank you for the point of personal privilege. And if there are no further questions, I ask unanimous consent that all members. Mr. Takano?
I just want to mention, I don't know if I mentioned this, but Mr. Sablon could not be with us for the questions, but I'll be submitting questions on his behalf.
Okay, that will be fine. And I think you're going to visit the Northern Marianas also. If there are no further questions, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. Without objection, so ordered. Hearing is adjourned.